discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duval, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who is just now putting the finishing touches on his baby New Year costume.
Tim Longo.
Yeah, don't send me any pictures.
Yeah, the sash is actually coming along really quite nicely for 2018. Great. But everything else is good, actually. Yeah, I'm set for the rest of it.
Good. I'm glad you found a diaper that size. Anyway, we're here talking about not the next section of Anachronauts, but our year-end special, kind of a year-end review, where we look back on sort of the things that we took away from games, and especially the anecdotes we pulled out of our interviews with various luminaries from the game development scene. I guess we should just get right to that. We had a number of really good guests this year, and I think we'll basically cover them all. So we should get quite a lot of good stuff. But what's your first takeaway moment from our interview?
I think it's one that we discussed in pre-show. We both had, but we can't not mention it, and that is the story from Darren Johnson and Reed Knight about being QA on TIE Fighter, and the specific story that Darren told that I believe Reed urged him to tell, because it became such an infamous classic story, and that's of him doing the impossible, which testers, that's their job, to do the impossible, right? To stress test the game to a place where the developers never thought it could go. And in the game, Darth Vader was a character that you met as he was flying his own ship, of course, and he was supposedly indestructible. That's how
leave
it
to QA to prove that wrong.
Yeah, that's how it was scripted to be, supposedly, and he found the loophole. And Darren, I think he said, I don't remember, and Brett will play the clip, but I think it was multiple hours of playing, and then he gathered a group around him, and I won't spoil it for those who will listen in a second, and he beat Darth Vader and did the impossible. So I thought it was a great anecdote for just QA, a microcosm of what QA goes through and how they push things beyond the boundaries of what are supposed to be done. Critical role for game development.
Yeah, let's listen.
Actually, There's only one ship in the game that I recall that's unkillable, and Darren figured out how to kill it. And that was Darth Vader. And Stretch, you want to tell that story before we get back to
let's hear that. Yeah.
Okay, you're flying in a TIE Advanced with Darth Vader, and you're on the same team. I don't remember anything else about the mission except that he's flying around like a bat out of hell because he's Darth Vader, right? So his flag was set to invulnerable in the editor, which means you couldn't shoot him down, you couldn't use ions on them or anything else. But if you rammed his ship with your ship, it would do just a speck of damage. So I would ram his ship, which would also hurt me, right? Do a little bit of damage, and then I would try to recharge myself as fast as possible while staying with him because he's flying all over the place. So I just sort of kept doing this for, I think it was an hour? Maybe 2 hours, I think it was.
It was a very long time.
Oh, man.
At that point, Reed's like, what are you doing today, Darren? Why are you trying to kill me?
No, there's a bug here, really. I believe it.
I was cheering him on.
Yeah, but I finally got his shields down, and then started hitting his armor, because he's recharging his shields the whole time, too. So, but you could just hit him a little bit faster and recharge yourself just a little bit faster than he can recharge himself. So my arm's getting sore. Because he's seriously just all over the screen all the time. Right. And you have to go faster than him, catch up to him, and quickly switch your. It was a whole thing. So anyway, after 2 hours of this, I finally hit him, and he dies. And then the game says, "You failed."
And it actually did tell you.
I failed the mission because he died, even though he had the flag set on.
So in that case, okay, so that probably, I think in that particular mission, probably one of the objectives was that he had to survive, right?
Yeah.
By enemies. So the scripting
I think what they realized in that case that basically they could not make him smart enough to survive by himself.
Yeah.
So he just, and they didn't want Darth Vader to look stupid, which he kind of did, because he'd roll in these tight circles. It was just ridiculous. But they just set an invulnerable flag on him. But I want to add one more thing to Darren's story, because he was standing there, and by the time Darth Vader was down to like 9% hull, because his hull didn't heal, he had a crowd of testers standing around him, including Dan or Mark, whoever was running a test pit at the time. And I was just like watching him, and little by little down 3%, 2%, 1%, and then Darth Vader blows up, and everybody goes, "Yeah!" It was awesome.
Yeah, mine is actually, that's a great story. I love that thing. Listening to it again and to find the clip, I just was laughing in my kitchen last night. So good times. My first one actually also comes from the TIE Fighter interviews, but the other interview we did with Larry Holland, and he talked a lot about the texture of the films and how the Empire was this big presence in the story, but that you didn't really get a lot of view into what it was like being a member of the Empire, and how, based on his anthropological background, he wanted to really bring all of that forward, and that it was sort of like researching something that really happened, in a way, to look at the films through that lens and to try to bring that to TIE Fighter.
But in some ways, showing the game from, or portraying the dark side, did seem, maybe just because I have I'm a schizophrenic personality, or see things from multiple perspectives, it did seem compelling and not obvious, but natural.
Yeah.
Because it was such a sort of a powerful presence in the movies that, getting closer to that or deeper into that just seemed
well, you did.
There was gold to be mined there.
Exactly. You didn't get to see it, right? I mean, the movies were always.
Yeah, it portrays it in a very black and white way, right? And the lily white and the dark black, and we know that the real world has many shades in between, and that was just, a lot of people say, reading literature, and the antagonists, that the dark characters, the tortured characters, they're the ones that are really has something to tell.
I was impressed with Larry's, just his analysis of what he was doing for Star Wars overall. I had the privilege to be able to work with Larry while I was in QA on XVT, and he just was always such a thoughtful developer. Even he was coming from the programming side of things, but he thought, as he always did as a creative director, and just kind of vision wise, and just the fact that you chose that clip and that he was thinking about things in that much depth for a video game was just a treat. So.
Yeah, and definitely something that we also took for Republic Commando in terms of trying to find the deeper story, and really TIE Fighter was sort of an influence on that, I'd say.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Which is something we discussed in the interview as well. So,
yeah.
I think I'll take this next one too, and we'll try to stay in time order as we went through the year. Our next interview was for Planescape Torment. And we had Chris Avalone, who was the creative director and did a large part of the writing. There were a number of good clips there, and we talked about a few of them. But one of the things I really took away and enjoyed, especially playing so many RPGs that have a chosen one, that was something we discussed at the time. He had a sort of different take on what the Nameless One meant and who he was, and how he was more of a broken one. One of those things you hated?
I feel like the Planescape Torment is more like a broken one story, because ultimately your existence in the framework of that world has caused more damage than you can fix. So at some point you have to take responsibility for it, which is kind of the key part, where you're not more the chosen one. It's just through your reckless actions and not quite wise choices, you've actually been damaging the multiverse around you. And at that point, when you realize the full extent of what you've done, even though you are this brand new identity, the question then becomes that now that I know that this is the mechanism with which I'm hurting everybody else, what do I do with that situation? How do I fix it? Or, do I want to fix it? And that, and again, like the Chosen One story, like is very, very played out, and people have an allergic reaction to it. But, that was one of the things that Planescape was trying to actively get away from, and then sort of put you in the framework of, you're kind of like the anti-chosen one. You're the one that's actually causing so many problems. So what do you do when you know that? And I think the weight of all those histories and then showing it to the player, even though they might be a really good person, I think is, I think that makes it kind of for a strong story.
Yeah, it's a clip that I really like because I think there's so much about that game that turns RPGs on their heads. And even though in the sense of being so disruptive to the multiverse or whatever that the Nameless One is, he is sort of special in that way. He's also the opposite of what you think of as a normal RPG hero, even though for much of the game you might feel like one. So I think it's a really remarkable game for so many reasons, but the character is one of the things that you just remember, and how meta some of it is. It's just it's a delight.
It's gonna directly relate to some of my takeaways later on. So yeah, it's a good call out for sure. I had forgotten about that one.
The next interview we did was with Mark Laidlaw, and I believe you, although we both picked this one, we'll let you go with one of the great snippets from that.
Yeah, we definitely both, in pre-show we talked about it, we both chose this one because it was, I think for me, such a shock in a way, because over the course of the series of us playing the game piece by piece, I think we brought it up multiple times, how as a milestone for the medium, Half-Life was the game that we all tend to point, though it wasn't maybe the first to exactly do it this way, it's the one we all point back to, of fully embracing first-person narrative and never taking control away from the player and not having cinematics, and really embracing and going whole hog in that direction. And then we come to find out in the interview with Mark that that actually was something that happened to them through the course of development. I believe even technically based, right? Like there was some technical reason or production reason, and maybe it was production that they chose not to do cinematics. That was actually something they had planned to do and was on their mind. But let's listen to Mark tell the story himself.
They never had a name. Like Ivan the Spice Baker. Ivan the Space Baker was a character that I saw later after I'd been there, and people sort of joked around about him, and I saw some models of that guy, but he was not seriously anybody that we used in demos or playing the game. There was no image for Gordon Freeman, really, because we didn't have a multiplayer mode. We didn't really have a camera. Chuck Jones was making models of Gordon, and we had this player model who was unnamed for a long time. We knew that you were a character, and then we knew you weren't Duke Nukem, so you weren't going to do smart aleck, wisecracks. But we didn't really know too much else about that guy until it kind of came down to the wire, and we were like, oh, we need a character to put on the box, and we might need a character we can see in cutscenes. We might need a character for this and that, because we really thought, like things like where Gordon gets knocked out and dragged, we thought that was going to be a cut to a third-person camera, if nothing else, like a security camera where you'd see it happen. So then at that point, we realized, are we going to see this guy going into the test chamber at the beginning? Do we need a model for a guy wearing a lab coat before he gets into the HEV suit? And we didn't have time to build any of that stuff. Nobody had really worked through, so a lot of the fixes were, I guess we just got to work with what we have, which means he's already in his HEV suit. We're never going to see him through a third-person camera, which, for me, it was liberating, and I was kind of excited to realize we were doing away with the cutscenes completely, but that was partly just driven by no model for the character that was in the lab coat, and no time. And it was like, okay, it was more of the streamlining that happened in the last few months of the project.
Yeah, it's really funny. I when I was making notes about the ones that I thought you would pick, the ones I thought you would pick were the ones that where your jaw just dropped to the floor, and you literally say that in the next interview. But before we get to that, I picked out one from Dario Casali, which actually ties into one of my takeaways. And he talked a lot about how both within Valve and in the industry at large, there is this constant sense of topping one another and having this competition, both for features and but also what you could do with the mechanics in a particular game, and just having this sort of scene where everybody was building stuff in this sort of frenetic, try to beat the other guy competition, and how that had kind of grown out of the mod community. So let's take a quick listen to Dario Casali, who's still with Valve.
But I think what happened is we kind of shifted gears where people were working very long hours. We were getting almost competitive with one another, where John Guthrie would come up with a particularly ingenious use of a mechanic that all of us already knew, but we hadn't thought about how to use it that way. And it would inspire us to say, okay, well, if he's done that, I'm going to have to use another mechanic in some obscure way to come up with something else that's interesting so I don't look bad. There were like five of us doing the same thing where we just started getting pretty competitive with one another.
Yeah.
Started stealing each other's ideas and then not admitting that we stole them.
I mean, that's funny. It makes me think of, I'm trying to remember what game we talked about this in. It might have been Fallout, but where you sort of had a scene going on, right? I mean, you had this like scene of level designers where you're all kind of competing and stuff like that, and kind of fighting with each other to get to the like, I want to be the best thing that shows this week or whatever.
I think there was competition between us, but there was also a lot of inspiration, and we were all so passionate about trying to beat off the competition, because we knew every so often we saw the latest features and demos from Sin.
Sin. Okay, I was trying to think who your competition might have been. Yeah, so Sin, Daikatana. Who else at that time?
Quake 2 as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And we just thought, wow, so this is basically living or dying, because this is our first our first product as a company. So every single one of us wanted to make damn sure that we had the best chance that we did to beat the competition.
Sure.
And so we just got really aggressive. We started, we didn't want to have long stretches of the game where you didn't encounter something new. We didn't want to have long stretches of the game where people would just quit playing because they were bored. So we just filled as much of the game as we could with as much density as we could. And because we didn't want to just do the same thing over and over, that meant we had to really innovate and we had to really differentiate the areas of the game to be slightly unique.
Yeah, so there was this. I think that's a great one to choose too, because it's that mentality of competition within a studio specifically that era definitely held true for that era. But I think the best studios even today still carry that forward, and I think it ends up making, as long as that's a healthy competition within the team, it does end up making the greatest games. And anecdotally, we didn't talk about this when Dario was on, but I feel like kind of we've heard through the rumor mill a little bit that Titanfall 2, its campaign, there was a lot of that experimentation and sort of back and forth within the level design group.
I can believe that.
And that campaign was amazing, and they did a great job with it. And each level was its own little mini game in a way, right? Like it had its own little gimmick, and it was very fresh. And the Infinity Ward guys at Respawn, that's apparently how they kind of thought that through for their campaign. So it's still true today.
Yeah, that's really cool, because one of the other things that I thought about with Dario was there was there's a discussion he had later in the interview talking about how single player is a lot more difficult to build levels for than multiplayer because you're trying to every second have something of interest for the player, and that's something that I think comes out of that really focused like level to level design that you're describing. So that's a cool one.
So going to my last one, it's one that really actually kind of came from our I don't know if it was our next consecutive interview with Julian Gallup. Was it? Okay, for XCOM. And it actually came from not either of us when it comes to the question that we asked him. A friend of mine, as I mentioned in the podcast, Chris Blum, who is a big fan of XCOM, and it influenced him as a designer for a lot of different things. But he always had this theory that the way that the sim was running is that it always felt to him that the aliens were playing the game at the same time as you were playing the game, just on the opposite side, that they were actually running the simulation. And it wasn't complete fakery. It was they were actually building their bases and they were choosing their locations and all that stuff. And so we got the privilege to actually ask Julian that question. And so let's listen to what he said.
They didn't say that. I mean, I guess because I tend to like more simulation-y approach to doing things. I like systems, and systems have some kind of logic and rationale behind them, which somehow relates to some world that you're trying to simulate. So, I liked all this stuff. The sort of geopolitical stuff where you've got the countries funding you, but they get upset if there's alien activity and you're not dealing with it. And and at the same time, the aliens have their own specific sort of sequence of things that they're trying to do, and they would usually start in a region and they would start doing, they'd have to do like 6 patrol missions, and if they do this successfully, then they start doing some abduction missions, and if they do 3 of those, then they do some terror missions, and then they try and build a base, and then they try and supply the base, and there's like 5 or 6 supply missions. And if they do that, then there's a continuous and increasing chance that if that base is inside a country, that country will get infiltrated and taken over and will cut their funding.
Amazing. So that's what happened to me.
I mean, you can basically what you can do is slow the aliens' progress down. Like, say, if they normally require to do a fixed number of missions, say they've got to do those 6 patrol missions before they go on to the abduction missions. If you shoot down one of their patrol ships before it finishes the mission, then they have to do another one because they haven't done their 6 missions. So you can sort of slow their progress down that way. Although with the base, once they've built a base, can be very dangerous, but then again can also be very rewarding because the supply ships tend to be full of loot. In fact, it's good if they build a base in a country which is not very important, because then you can just keep trying to intercept the supply ships. And,
right. In my case, the United States.
That's probably the worst country. You could let them build a base in.
Yeah, that's a great clip. And as a person who's programming a sim right now, I'm thinking about that a lot and thinking about how to make the entities that are in the game also be acting in the same way that you do most of the time. So that's like a big deal. And it's actually something I've always tried to do going back to Starfighter. So that was kind of cool and to hear and reinforce. I had a couple other clips that we could have pulled from Julian's. One was the flying under the radar that was involved because of Microprose and Microprose UK and Spectrum Holobyte, and just how we managed to get this game because of competition between studios.
Unbelievable. And they were so like we talked about this with Fallout 1. They were also kind of under the radar to some degree too, but XCOM was even more to the degree where it felt like a lot of the company thought it was canceled or something like that. Wasn't that the case?
Because they were told to cancel it, and they just kind of kept it off the books.
Jeez.
Buried it in the budget somewhere. It's extraordinary. And the other one actually was that he talked about adding the dynamic difficulty at the very last moment. Because he had never played the game through before it shipped. That's just crazy to me. The person who knew the most about how the simulation worked had never actually been able to play through the whole game before it shipped. So that's still my experience. How'd you do finishing that since then?
Oh, XCOM?
Yeah, you've finished you've gone to Mars, right?
No, I still haven't.
No, I figured not. I was just
you're pulling
giving myself an opportunity to give you.
Did you ever finish?
No,
neither. It's the only game that I haven't finished for the podcast for sure. So I also lost my save, which I think I told you about. So.
Oh yes, we didn't. That wasn't on the air. You lost your save. Oh no, it's gone.
Yeah.
Yes, you won't be finishing that.
Yeah, my laptop was stolen actually, and the thing I was most bummed about was losing those saves.
It's the worst.
Tragic.
Well, maybe we'll give it a shot with Phoenix Point next year.
Totally. I'm looking forward to it.
And okay, all right. The second part of the year-end podcast is to go back and look at some of our takeaways from the various games we've played. I should have put a list in front of myself here so that I could actually recount all the games we played. Of course, we were finishing TIE Fighter at the beginning of the year, and we had those two interviews, and we moved on from that to our Fumito Ueda series on Ico and Shadow of the Colossus. We played Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver. We played A Link to the Past, Planescape Torment, Half-Life, Super Mario World, XCOM UFO Defense, Silent Hill 2, Super Mario 64, and we're currently playing Anachronauts. That is most of the games that I played this year.
Me too.
I've been pretty busy, as I know you have. So yeah, that's a good series of games. That's a good second year for the podcast.
I mean, I didn't think we'd make it this far, so I'm ecstatic that we're having our second year end episode. So it's cool to look back. I'm proud of the podcast.
I am too, for sure. What is your first takeaway from the year?
Okay, so my first takeaway, and these aren't really in any particular order, but the first one's a kind of a threefer because it actually, once I thought about it for one game, I realized it actually hits two other games we played this year, and I actually think it might be a kind of a macro takeaway for me for the year, especially as you just rattled off all the things we played, because I think we talked about it in nearly all of them. And the way I describe it here is just what I'm calling it is the importance of thematic consistency. And as I went back through the list today as well, realizing we started with Ueda's games, there's something about his games or their games that are consistent from a thematic and sort of foundational perspective that I've always admired. And when, in their case, they're a studio that has basically chosen to do this, and when you see one of their games, you know it's one of their games. And so maybe you can say they're all spiritual sequels to each other or whatever, but that's not even what I'm talking about. It's more of each of the games, and then kind of the world, the unofficial world that they've created has such a consistency of theme and kind of, I don't know, purpose and motivation that a lot of games don't achieve. And so I just really appreciate that, and it kind of comes to my mind in my day-to-day world of how I could do the same thing and how to try to make sure that there is that consistency. But then what I realized is we actually talked a lot about that with Torment, because Torment had a similar, thematic consistency. And as you kind of mentioned with one of the quotes, when it comes to, the nameless one and the broken being the broken one, and how that was really, full commitment from Chris and his team to achieve this consistency. And then the final one that I actually just thought of as we were starting to record is going actually backwards to TIE Fighter, and it's a little bit timely because of Battlefront 2 coming out and what their campaign was attempting to do, and then seems like it had gone in a different direction. TIE Fighter stuck with that theme of being a bad guy and being in the Empire and they didn't ever divert from that. They stayed true to course, and that theme, embracing it even more so when the Emperor comes into the picture. That theme was consistent, and that's what made each of those games, in my opinion, stand out. and be unique and different from other games, and memorable. So that's my kind of macro big takeaway. First one.
Yeah, that's a really good one. And in fact, it's so good it was also on my list. I specifically call that Planescape and Ueda. I think it actually carries through to a lot of the other games. I certainly think you see a lot of it in XCOM. I think you see a lot of it
Silent Hill too.
In Silent Hill. Thank you. That was where I was going next. So this is maybe one of those big takeaways from the best of games, is that they have strong themes, even if they're occasionally delivered with a light touch, which I think we know by now. I personally appreciate those games that can deliver them with a light touch despite strong theming. It's one of those things that makes games memorable to me and makes them cut a groove in, is when they really relate everything to their themes. I think it's true to a lesser degree in some of the Japanese games we played this year, the Nintendo games.
That's what I was going to say. Nintendo isn't actually one that does this that much, I would say, which is ironic.
But I think that they have their own things that
not required.
So.
It's not required.
Yep, nope. But it's definitely one of those things that makes games stick with me. I know that when we talk about Metal Gear Solid someday, that'll probably come up again for you, because there's definitely a lot of that in that whole series, and each one has its own, and that's maybe why those games resonate so strongly with you in particular. So. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was on my list too. And since it was, I'll go ahead and do the second one, so you're not stealing my thunder.
Okay.
My second one was actually also Ueda, the Eco and Shadow of the Colossus, and that for me was the holistic design, is what I called it, where camera controls and the use of space were so hand in hand that every moment was sort of delightful. Even if it was a sort of darkly themed game, in particular with Shadow of the Colossus, the way that choosing a gameplay mechanic like dragging Yorda around or riding Agro around, or even climbing around on the backs of these giant monsters, led to a type of space that you had to have to be able to enable the camera that you would need to have to be able to see the mechanic at work, and how that all controlled together was something that I never really thought about back when I played these games originally. I just sort of played them as a player and not analytically in any way. Mm-hmm. And for me, revisiting them, and in this case for each of them, it was at least my third time through the game. It was terrific, and that really stuck out to me in a way that it hadn't before. I think this is also true in Mario 64 and its camera and controls, which is something we talked a lot about, and I think that they are rightly the sort of ne plus ultra of 3D platforming as a result. And of course, the latest Mario 3D game is amazing as well in this regard, and maybe about as perfect as it's ever been. So I will say, thinking back on it, I think The Last Guardian, although it was my favorite game of last year, I think did not quite nail this, particularly the spots where passageways were really narrow. The camera was often wonky in those spots, and I know that was usually the big negative takeaway that people had from the game. Yeah. And I can recognize that as a flaw, while at the same time feeling like, yeah, but when it wasn't, it was amazing. So anyway, that was my second takeaway, that holistic design of how all this is put together.
Yeah. No, that's a great one for sure. I think in retrospect, similarly to yourself, as far as going through it with the podcast, the pacing of the podcast and being more analytical. Again, this was maybe my fourth time playing, all told, but I don't think it ever dawned on me why Shadow specifically has always stuck with me and is probably one of my favorite games of all time, and many people's favorite. I think it is that holistic design that at least as a designer resonates with me, because it's something to be appreciated, and I know how difficult it is to achieve. Not that I've ever achieved it, but I know it's hard, and I think that's why it's still stuck with me today. So.
I think you've done quite well, so don't feel too bad.
I don't know. We'll see. Yeah, keep learning every day.
That's for sure.
You want to move into the second one?
Yeah, go to your second one.
Okay. Actually, I have 4, so I'm actually going to skip this one that I have here and move to another one. It's actually one I didn't anticipate at all, and as I was looking at the list, it kind of dawned on me, and it's with Silent Hill, and basically it's the ye old less is more. I don't even know if I talked about this in the series while we were playing the game, but in retrospect, the thing that really surprised me about Silent Hill, and I'm really happy that you introduced it to me. You've been talking about it for years, and I just never played it. So I'm glad we had a reason to force me to play it this time, because it was it's one of the best examples, especially of that era, of a less is more game. And what I mean by that is video games, because we're interactive and because our medium is so different from any other medium, we have this ability to give more to the player than, say, than I think other mediums, because the player is in control. They can go and engage and have agency in what they're doing. And so I feel like we tend to overtell, overshow, and kind of overpresent many aspects of video games. And some of it is, I think, cultural with what video games are. We're still getting out of our sophomoric phase, I think, and still think that that's what we're supposed to do. But Silent Hill really surprised me, because it, not only in the way that they chose to utilize less is more for the horror aspects compared to something like a Resident Evil, which was generally always in your face. This was the most scared I've been in a game in a long time, and it was low fidelity. I was playing in the original way, so it wasn't like a high-res version, but I still was scared. The fidelity was enough, and also with the story, I feel like less is more. Like, we were still theorizing about what the meanings of certain things were in the story by the end, and we'll never know some of them. And I was just happily surprised at how much, whether intentional or not, how much discipline they had with the game, and not trying to overdo everything. So that was an unexpected one for me.
Yeah, yep, for sure. It is. I'm glad I was able to make you play that game. It's just a miraculous game to me that found its way to actually even to a Western market. Never mind to be made at all, but it's just a terrific game, and I think the horror also plays particularly well for us, because even though it's set in a Western location, it still feels like an Eastern game.
Oh, absolutely.
Horror, so yeah, terrific. I guess I'll do my last one. One theme that I felt I saw a lot through the year that came up again and again was the shining through of individual efforts. And I'm going to cite Mario 64 in particular, and Half-Life as well. But also right now, as we're playing through Anachronox, we're seeing it as well, where there's a really strong voice in the writing, something we talked about in the last episode. But with Mario 64 having those lots of little experiments that it felt like they were having, playing with the new mechanics and figuring things out. And that was actually also a theme in our discussion with Dario, of getting something new from the programmers and seeing what you could do with it. But at the same time, having a bunch of level designers, each focusing on a single idea for a level, and really paying off on that. Those individual touches and individual efforts, I think, make those games really stand out. And you can see a mind at play in a way in the design, in the level design, rather than the sort of macro design or what have you. It's not about the specifics of the moving around mechanics or the shooting mechanics or the jumping and the physics, or even the RPG elements of Anachronox. It's more about the feel that comes through from the design elements that those interact with. So whether it's the switching or killing bosses that are much bigger than you, or dealing with the Marines, or having the turn yourself into different sizes through the pipes of the big and tiny island, or the flying, or the different hats. And I mean, just the millions of little ways in which they played with their mechanics in those games in individual levels. And then, of course, with the sort of strong voice of Anachronox, all those individual efforts, I think, really come through. It's something that I wrote about in my blog a long time ago, and I think I may have linked it in some show notes this year. But there's times where you see something in a game and you know that was just a small passion project for a person, or maybe a couple of people, to bring that bit of a game to life. And I feel like that's something that we connect to just on a human level. So whether or not we know it's happening, I think we feel it. So I particularly took that away this year.
Yeah, that's an awesome one. It's actually close to my third one. So, but the concept, like I think, there go the dogs.
There's another personal touch.
Personal touch of my failure. So I just think that I worry sometimes. I think it's a great takeaway, because I worry sometimes that our industry has gotten to a bit of a homogenization of how we develop, where we have set up a certain number of rules or goals that we have with a project, and everyone abides by them. And there isn't always enough space for individuals to experiment and find and discover things, that unexpected things out of the development, because we're either so worried about schedule, or we're pushing through, or we're just kind of focused on the production aspects of things, and there's not that time to experiment and find those unexpected. So I think it's a really good point, and I think it's something that as an industry we have to keep working on, because we've talked about it a lot, but we've gotten to such this games are big business, place that the homogenization seems like it's a requirement to survive, but it's really not.
Well, it's an efficiency issue, I think. And when there's a reason why in the Army, every private needs to be able to do a certain number of things, and you need to be able to expect that you can fit any peg into this particular square hole, right? And I think that when you get to the scale that projects are now, that's sort of what naturally happens. We're also a young industry often, although that's changing, and so that happens as well, that there's this set of skills you're expected to have, and maybe you haven't developed a voice yet. And I think earlier in games, it was maybe more the case that those individual voices came through because people were starting in games at different ages, because games were just sort of getting going. So I think there's a lot of reasons why it's changed, or was different in the past anyway. But yeah, it's something I particularly enjoy when I feel it. So
yeah, that's good.
So what's your last one?
My last one, like I said, kind of relates to that, and I was specifically focused on some of the revelations that I really had when we started dissecting Super Mario 64's cameras, and I describe it. My title for it was "Innovate Through Experimentation," so that's why I said it hits sort of a little bit of what you were talking about with that individual perspective on things. But just to elaborate on it a little bit more, 3D cameras, especially for third-person games, are pretty synonymous with games today. They're pervasive. They're around and everywhere, and we don't think twice about them anymore. They're just there, and people have cracked different nuts with them and had come up with different new techniques to iterate and make them better and better every year. And so it's great. We're taking that sort of concept and going farther with it. But when you play arguably one of the first games, if not the first game, to really tackle it in a wholehearted way, something like as complicated as 3D cameras, for a 3D world with a third-person character. Arguably, from a camera perspective, one of the hardest things you probably can do. I was trying to think of some harder things before writing this one down, but
hit a baseball going 100 miles per hour.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, you mean in games?
In games, not in development. But what it seemed, and you were kind of alluding to this with the individual contributions, what it seemed like they did to me, and we talked a little bit about this in the series, they took their experimentations and they shipped them because each level was its own unique, crazy thing and cool in its own way. We talked about the rabbit thing that Fred Marcus, had kind of given me that story, and they shipped that rabbit. They put him in a different maze, but they shipped him in the game. But those sorts of notions help them develop what a 3D camera needs to be, and I think we quoted somebody on, saying that anyone who hasn't, stolen from Nintendo from Mario and Zelda is lying. This game is not necessarily completely a blueprint, but it's pretty close to a blueprint of what to do when it comes to 3D cameras. And using the level design and the levels that you play in that game, which are all, not connected and nonsensical and Mario in their Mario way, which is fine, but you can see them struggling with the problem that they gave themselves and solving it bit by bit in a way. You can even down to like this hallway is, they probably learned this, and then this jumping sequence, they probably learned this, because you can kind of watch the camera. And I just was, just flabbergasted at the difficulty of that challenge and how much of an impact that we don't even realize that it had on all of us. So, you gotta experiment to find that innovation, and you need to allow time for that experimentation to happen. And then in Mario's case, you can also ship your experiments, which isn't always the case.
Which is definitely not always the case. I wonder too if that was also part of not just the holistic design of the Ueda games, but maybe the individual colossi and things like that. To be experiments of, well, what if you had this sort of thing and it added this mechanic? Can we do a flying thing or a swimming thing? The swimming thing is the one that feels like the weirdest in terms of how is that going to work? And and I mean, who knows? It's difficult to say with those sorts of things if that's true, but it does make me wonder. So yeah, that's definitely a really good one. So. Yeah, it's been quite a year.
Good year.
What a bunch of good games, and of course we're going to continue on with Anachronauts. We mentioned last week. We're going to play To the Surface of Democritus.
Yep.
So that should be a good sizable chunk, and we'll come back and have something for you after the new year about that. If you're playing along, that's terrific. I will probably stream some of that. On the 30th, I guess, is the Saturday before New Year's. So if you wanna come and watch, you can find me. Check us out on the Twitter. I will remember to tweet out before I do so. But yeah, man, it's been a great second year to do this with you. It's a highlight of my week to be able to discuss this stuff with you every week.
Likewise,
do you have any other final thoughts?
No. It's likewise for me as well. The podcast has been an unexpected delight for me. It's definitely a lot of extra work in the rest of life, but it's work that I don't mind doing. And as much as I'm in the middle of trying to get my 70th star in Mario, and the difficulty I'm having with trying to, do that in the short amount of time that I have, I've never regretted it. I'm always finding something out that I just didn't anticipate. And, and I try to be consistent with, the teams that I work on. It's just, that we don't know everything, and we're learning every day. And I try to reinforce that with everybody because there's so many smarty pants with on teams that we work with sometimes, and the podcast has really taught me that is, really, really true 20 years into our careers, and we're still learning stuff from these games that have been around forever. So I'm appreciative of that because hopefully it'll make me a better developer over time too. So.
Well, absolutely. I feel like I've got tons of room to grow. So programming and design are both humbling activities. you just every time you think you've got a handle on them, there's something new that you're learning about them. So, So for sure, totally agree. I do want to actually make a quick shout out here at the end. Again, I feel like people are hearing his name frequently, but that's Aaron Evers. He sent us each a package. We will each have nice new Dev Game Club coffee mugs and some other goodies for here as Christmas comes and the new year. And so thank you very much for that, Aaron.
So big, thanks. Yeah.
Yep. He included a letter to us in the package. So yours I think is coming tomorrow, because you live on an island. But one part of it I thought I'd read from the middle is this. This passion is what comes across in your podcast. You've said many times that game development is difficult, and you should love it to do it. Listening to your discussions, it's clear that you are longtime friends who love what you do, and you've captured lightning in a bottle with this idea of a book club for older games. I think it's a fantastic concept for a podcast. And really, I can ask for nothing more than that, Aaron. So thank you again so very, very much.
Wow.
It's been great. We will see you all in 2018, and hopefully Tim will have changed into normal clothes again by then. In the meantime, you can find me on Twitter at Brett_Duville and him at
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end.
And of course, the podcast is at Dev Game Club. You can send us email. We have a couple for next week, but we thought we'd just leave this as it was this week to devgameclub@gmail.com. Thanks so much, and good night.
Good night.